Hello everyone and welcome to the second session in this webinar series, Connecting Directly with Global Experts. My name is Tanya Leach and I'm the Regional Project Officer for Darling Downs Southwest. Today's session is delivered by Dr. Pete Stebbins around the topic High Performing Teams in Education. So today, as we move through the session, if you have questions that pop to mind, please pop them in the chat box. I'll be collating these, and if appropriate, Pete will pause and reply as we go along. So without delaying the presentation any longer, I'll hand over to Dr. Pete.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you everyone for giving up your time to, I guess, engage in what I think is quite an interesting and innovative way to have a look at leadership teams in Education Queensland. What we're wanting to do in this session is work through the high performance teams framework, which is very much a lens, kind of like the analogy of glasses, where we might be short or long-sighted, but we then put a pair of glasses on and we get to see things more clearly, and in seeing things clearly it's much quicker and easier for us to identify opportunities for improvement, and that's very much what the high performance teams framework is about. And also have a look at how we apply this in education and share some stories along the way. There's over 100 schools now that have high performance teams action plans and that have been working through this framework to enjoy and improve their workplace culture as well as stretch towards better student outcomes. So let's get started. Apologies, I'm just getting used to the technology. What you can see in front of you now is what we want to do in our hour together. I want to step back a little bit and just ground ourselves in why teams, I guess, fail, or why we have underperforming teams. Some of the levers and pulleys that I guess create the circumstances where many people have had to work in a low performance team or a low morale environment, and sometimes it's helpful just to reconnect with those important drivers for that. In the second part of our time together, I want to unpack the high performance teams framework in an education context and provide some simple, clear examples of strategies people use in schools to be able to go from good to great in terms of where their school culture is. And in part 3, have a look at how the actual experience occurs over a 12-month period, and most importantly, look at the outcome data, look at the results. Does this actually work? Does it make a difference? So by way of introduction, as we said, if we consider the high performance teams framework as simply a pair of glasses that we can put on, and in doing so see things in a simpler, clearer frame of view, you can see the model up there, and it's quite a simple model. We're not really reinventing the wheel here. We're simply saying that high performance teams are leadership teams in education who can fit in, who can really support the broader objectives of the department, of the school, of the region, but also stand out, who can succeed and achieve outstanding results, both with academic achievement, but also with morale and running a healthy workforce. There are 2 factors that sit inside that, as you can see. Getting the results we need, which is generally very clear to all schools in terms of where they are and where they need to be around student outcomes. The second and equally important factor, as you can see, is engagement, and that is the glue or stickiness that allows us to stay in the same orbit, to work together to be able to deliver those outcomes. And it's important that we recognize a high-performance school isn't just the school that gets the greatest results. It's also the school that has the least turnover, the highest morale, and the highest levels of staff well-being. one thing I've noticed, someone having lectured in this sort of stuff with MBAs or postgrad students, and my background in organisational psychology, achievement and engagement are sort of woolly terms. They're a bit vague, and sometimes we can raise our eyebrows, and certainly teaching staff are quick to spot things that may or may not be that practical or useful. So we translate this down into 4 key performance indicators, 4 KPIs, and you can see them there. The first one is about vision and action, and in education that's about our school-wide pedagogy, and it's about the activity cycles, the engagement, the points of contact that all our staff, our P&C and our students have with that school-wide pedagogy, so it really becomes a living process of transformation. The second achievement-based KPI is that performance reporting one. And certainly a lot of education and also healthcare is another place I work. These 2 departments, they measure a lot of things, and people can get quite frustrated on the ground with all of the measurement when they can't connect that in a meaningful way to what they need to do each day. So performance reporting in a high performance team is not only about collecting the information, but organising and marketing and selling that data in a way that's really meaningful for your staff. The final parts of this puzzle over on the engagement side are about leveraging diversity, and that's about diversity simply meaning individual differences, things that rub us up the wrong way, not just those bigger ticket items around gender equality or race or religion, personality clashes and things that niggle each other. And it's about a school culture and the leadership team having a clear strategy in place there to enable people to safely give each other feedback when they feel like they're getting rubbed up the wrong way. And we do that through above and below the line behaviour charts and other things we'll go into during this presentation. But also some sort of onboarding process or regular training process when we're able to see our different personality styles in play, when we're able to lightheartedly recognise why we rub each other up the wrong way. The last of those 4 KPIs is about work life and well-being. And naturally, as adults, our own well-being is ultimately our responsibility, as is our own work-life balance. But as an employer under workplace health and safety obligations, all school leadership teams need to have some sort of system or strategy in place to maximise the staff's well-being and minimize any negative distress related to the demanding job that at times teaching can be. So we're looking to have strategies there. So that triangle therefore represents a simple way to look at the complex world of leadership in schools and some very simple things that could be done to start that journey up to a new level of performance. In the High Performance Teams program, there's a couple of things that we like to go through. First one is the RPL. So we run this program in clusters, and we have quite a number of things that go on each year. And one of the good things that can happen for leaders doing this program is that they can get credits towards postgraduate training. And I think that's one of the really great initiatives that's happening between universities and government departments and providers of training where there's an efficiency there. So all of our High Performance Teams graduates certainly are able to benefit in progressing towards coursework masters or coursework doctorates, which is a good thing. Looking at what actually happens in the whole year experience, we have 2 foundation days, and in that we, as you can see on your screen now, the first foundation day introduces that framework we've gone through, as well as having a look at some leadership content, getting people to disclose and think about their leadership behaviour and power dynamics, conflict, non-verbals, some of those more subtle things. We have a strong emphasis on that in how we start to build up our leadership teams that attend these programs. In day 2, these days are usually back-to-back, we get into some of the dynamics that cause team dysfunction. We do a profiling exercise where we actually can kind of, albeit humorously, start to understand how we can annoy and frustrate each other simply by having different strengths. And of course, it's an action learning environment, and each leadership team that participates in the program develops a comprehensive strategic plan that guides how they then implement this in a real-world school context for the year. We then tend to see people, but generally around sort of May, June, sometimes July, for a mid-program follow-up. And in that, we tend to target resiliency burnout, as you can see. We do some refresh around supportive and strategic leadership. In some cases, we have guest education experts around pedagogy and curriculum. And we do your 360s. Everyone in this program completes a leadership 360. And so we have a supportive environment where they can kind of come to grips with their feedback, as well as synthesize the bits they need to take away from that versus the bits they might not be ready to take on board. And that action plan hardwires through the process, so we get a lot of rigor in terms of peer-to-peer feedback as we present how we're going with our schools. And as leadership teams, we all muck in together to support one another and provide any suggestions or examples of other ideas from other schools. And that's probably one of the things I love the most about this program, is the collaboration between school leaders to be there for each other, to challenge each other, and to stretch out with innovative ideas and workarounds as we move our cultures from good to great. In the last session, which is typically sort of late October through to early December, everyone's together again, and we're again really working hard on that peer-to-peer feedback, and almost in what we call a communities of practice cycle by then. There's a high trust, high clarity, high support environment, and so there's a lot of disclosure about how we can grow as leaders. We also tend to tackle that thorny topic of work-life balance from a leadership strategy context, and again have dedicated outcome presentation time, and again have guest people assisting with some of that presentation work, often from an academic perspective, again to just sharpen and shape that so that if they are wanting RPLs, credits in Masters Doctorates, that's all going to flow smoothly for them. During the program, we have a 360, but I'll jump through this stuff quite quickly now so we can just get into what it's really all about. And in that, we have a behavioural model of supportive and strategic leadership, which we obviously train quite heavily through in the course of the program. And it's a really interesting opportunity for people to rate themselves as well as rate their peers, and start to, or have peer ratings, sorry, and start to understand the congruence or incongruence. Typically, people are surprised by how good they're doing on peer referee, and in Australia we tend to cut ourselves down a bit, and so often this is a positive process, and unexpectedly so for many people. The other really interesting part of the High Performance Teams package is we introduce a little school pulse survey, a little email, as well as some toolboxes for your staff, some online wellbeing courses, and some monthly reporting that goes back to the staff. And that data then provides a continuous feed for both the staff themselves. We send out group averages, so we absolutely protect people's privacy, but we send out group averages, and in doing that all year, not only are the leaders who come to the program participating, but staff every month see their average results pinned up on the notice board, and at staff meetings they're discussing what proactively they're doing to take their workforce wellbeing to a higher level. So I guess that's just some of the sandpits, some of the recipes that make it all quite a powerful process and a positive experience for the schools. The next thing I want to dip into is some of the content around why teams fail. And so for the next 5 or 10 minutes, I thought we could just anchor to some of those levers and pulleys that we train our school leaders in. Often they've seen this stuff before, so I'll be quite quick through this, but effectively we have a look at individual, group and system reasons teams get into trouble, and then I might leave you with a question that we typically leave our workshop groups around your own risk analysis. So when we come to individual factors, there's lots of stuff we bring to the workplace as individuals. Our personalities, our qualifications, our experience, our physical presence. But when it comes to groups and team failure, the number one thing I like to spend time on with people is understanding the powerful reflex of conflict avoidance. Because all of us have a sense of, I guess, tension or stress and a feeling of threat at some point in a meeting when other people start to look disinterested or hostile or huff and puff with their breathing or lean back and roll their eyes to the ceiling as we're talking. And what many of us forget is just those little things, even though they don't suggest we're about to be physically hurt or anything else, nonetheless make us anxious. And when we start to feel anxious, we have this stress response, this fight, flight. And obviously it's very subtle for most of us. But in any given staff meeting with more than 5 or 10 people present, at least half the room during the course of 30 minutes will at times have these very low-grade responses of unease as things happen. And it's entirely normal, but our failure to understand its impact is what causes the problem in teams. Let's keep going though, and I'll explain what I mean. So what I want to put to you here is a question. We have to choose, albeit it's a staff meeting, it's not a physical altercation, but nonetheless, once that trigger, that stress response is starting to wind up in us, we have to choose to either flee or avoid or stay quiet in a meeting or confront or fight or, bring up what's going on. So to consider, I guess, at that reflex level what, qualified and skilled grown-ups would do, I just want to ask 3 quick questions. The first one's regarding physical safety. Objectively speaking, theoretically speaking, are you more likely to be physically hurt by fighting or fleeing? Simple question. Disconnected from everything, which one will get you more physically hurt?
Just type your answers into the chat box as you reflect on that question.
As we've got some coming through now, and it's pretty obvious, and I apologize, you've already got the slide on your screen. As you can see, avoidance is more common. And so again, we've got this stress response trigger. It's natural for us to immediately flee. Self-preservation is extremely powerful, as it says on that screen for you, as you can see. And our ability, our innate ability to avoid, and in a team meeting, what we're talking about isn't running away actively. We're talking about the choice to remain silent. But you can see some statistics there. It's so powerful, our choice to flee, that even in recent war, in conflicts, in a more extreme example, even though 30,000 people knew that only 800 people were coming and 30,000 people knew they had the advantage with all the intelligence they had, so great was their fear of harm that they fled. So it's a very powerful reflex to want to avoid. Let's try another question. Mental safety. Are you more likely to get psychologically distressed, mentally hurt, end up with a psychological condition by fighting or fleeing? I'll get you to throw an answer or type an answer into the screen when you can. Well, those of you who picked avoiding, which is certainly the principals and teachers I work with, it's a mixed bag here, but those of you who picked avoiding, i.e. running away from the fight to reduce the likelihood I'll have a psychological problem, are right. A lot of people think that running away, though, I'll feel guilt and regret and I'll end up becoming unwell. And whilst it's true that you can feel guilt or regret when you avoid something, as you can see the statistics there, people who actively end up in conflict are much more likely to have serious problems psychologically. So again, there's another instinctive reason why we choose avoiding over confrontation once we start to feel a little bit threatened. The last question here is, when it comes to choosing between fight and flight, are you more likely to break the law by fighting or fleeing? Again, this one's pretty obvious. Obviously, the world we live in reinforces and rewards us for avoiding things, and quite frankly, we get in a lot of trouble if we do get into conflict. And even if we've got self-defense as a reason, if you think about the way society works, that only gets taken into account after the fact. So apologies for the excuse me, the extensive theoretical trip there, but it makes a really important point that I hope you, as school leaders, can grasp and understand. And I hope that you can look at your staff in a completely different light now. Firstly, we have a primordial urge, an unconscious, a deep-seated urge to avoid conflict once we start to feel threatened. And that translates to a bias against anything we feel triggered by. So we're hardwired to avoid even basic leadership or team-based tasks, such as giving feedback and having difficult conversations. We expect far too much of our staff and even of ourselves as leaders if we think we can just kind of head into that environment and spontaneously be able to have courageous conversations or fierce conversations. We actually need to be trained to do something that's against our own gut reaction. And so the question we ask frontline leaders and when we ask school leaders is, well, what systems and structures and training do you have in place so that everybody's always well rehearsed in having robust, supportive, but nonetheless effective feedback conversations? Because we need that level of regular training because we face such a powerful primordial urge to not do it. The second element of having a quick check-in around group failure, and I'll move a bit quicker now, is around this whole idea of groupthink and this other idea of the Abberline Paradox. And what we ask people when we do high-performance teams is we ask this question. If you had to choose between remaining silent over an issue at a meeting, and therefore, keeping quiet and everybody happy, or speaking up because you believed it was wrong, what would you do? There's usually a bit of and a bit of awkwardness in that one because people, they prefer the answer of it depends. They don't really want to say yes, I'd speak up, or no, I wouldn't. And that makes sense, of course, because when we think about schools and the types of things that we talk about in our staff meetings, we don't tend to have morally extreme or black and white things go on. However, typically once we start to feel that stress response trigger, we have that avoidance mechanism we just talked about, and so what we do is we keep our mouth shut and we look around the room and look for the status quo. We wait for someone else to bring up the answers or take on the position. Why do we have to carry the can? And that's a healthy and normal process that's seen in teams everywhere. But as you can see, there's a but in that, because the more that happens, we go to the meeting, something comes up, we're not really happy about it, but we sit back and just watch. We create team dynamics, and in those team dynamics, we lower our personal responsibility and increase avoidance. And the more we do that, the less we have to, assert ourselves, the more we go with the flow. And the more we go with the flow, the more we build up this unconscious bias. And this unconscious bias is called groupthink. Groupthink is where even in highly cohesive and exclusive groups, so even in groups where people really like each other a lot, let alone groups where there's some tensions and desire to avoid conflict, people want to agree on things because it's easier, it's less distressing than adopting proper rational decision-making procedures. But there's plenty of examples of groupthink, and you actually see it a lot in leadership teams and staff meetings. But some of the big-ticket items are like the weapons of mass destruction, a highly public, well-known situation where very bright, very organized, strategic people managed to reach an agreement and take a course of action that was entirely wrong. For those of us a bit older and remember the 60s and John F. Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and for those of us who have just read some of the findings from the Royal Commission, there's the local example of groupthink around the steering committee that ran the Queensland Health payroll disaster. And so what we're trying to say in these environments is that groupthink is a real issue, even in school leadership teams, and try and get people in touch with how that works. the most extreme version of that's the Abberline Paradox, and that's finally just an example of a process where people engage in things, and this might sound strange to you, but people actually head off and do things that they don't want to do because they think everyone else wants to. You know, one of the classic examples of this is staff social activities. Some school leaders I know don't necessarily want to have a barbecue or do drinks on a particular night, but they feel they have to. And so they head along and do all of that, and then all the staff go along too, and only half the staff like socializing, the others want to be with their families or do something else. But you get this process occurring where we all start doing a whole bunch of things to be a team or to be together or because we have to. And all of a sudden you realize, hang on, I didn't want to do it, and half the room didn't want to do it. That type of groupthink is really dysfunctional and extremely common, particularly where you get large workforces, you know, like larger schools, where everyone's trying to get along. But typically only 30 or 40% of your workforce will really love having drinks and social functions, yet 80% of your workforce will go. It's far more productive to have the honest conversation and allow people to express how they want to get along in different ways and give everyone space. So the point of trying to understand groupthink is simply to start to get leadership teams in schools to think about how much effort they're putting into people-pleasing as opposed to prioritizing the important strategic issues in the school. And most importantly, building a culture that is ultimately focused around what we're here to do, and all the social activity then supports that, as opposed to trying to be really social and then fingers crossed hoping the performance happens. The last part that we cover in the foundations of high performance teams when it comes to the team dysfunction is around happy versus healthy workplaces. And what we remind people about here is the Hawthorne Effects, which are very much about some research that points out that when you change something in the workplace, in this case it's an experiment where they turn the lights up or down, productivity goes up. And so we call that the honeymoon effect. Simply doing something new and novel will generally have a good effect in your workplace. But we don't want to confuse that with making lasting positive change. And as high performance leadership teams, we're not into simply turning the lights up and down, we're into making lasting positive change. Unfortunately, a lot of leaders in schools feel like it's the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and they're dealing with people who want pay increases or changes to the days off or time in lieu. They're dealing with productivity problems and people with differing workloads getting frustrated, and they're spending a lot of their time dealing with a small percentage of staff that might be struggling, and in turn neglecting a large group of staff who might be doing well. We liken this to what we call the popular leadership style, where we're so busy trying to just deal with and keep people happy that we end up creating all sorts of problems in the long run, with people becoming cynical about the organization and having entrenched negative behaviors, acting out in ways that are not helpful for our school culture. We know that that's not a good idea, because if we get caught in that cycle, there's a lot of costs. And those costs are particularly around your stress claims and the cost of psychological injury, new staff turnover, and loss of key customers. But when it comes to education, we like you to think about a particularly angry parent that politicizes something and how diverse and damaging one or two of those things can be for a school. Look, wrapping up this section now, I think what we really are trying to share with you in terms of setting the foundations for high performance teams is this whole notion about relationships and performance. We summarize it up to try and get our leaders to remember that if all you do is try and keep people happy in order to get a great job done, to get achievement, then you end up having to run to the status quo. You're trying to keep everybody happy, and in keeping everyone happy, you can't push people out of their comfort zone because they become unhappy. The net result, of course, is gradual failure. On the other hand, if your school-wide pedagogy, if your vision, if your targets, if why you're there and what it's all about becomes the goal, and then all of that staff, drinks, socialization, and everything else is always tied to achieving that goal or a reward because we made a milestone to that goal, then you'll have a group of people that can tolerate being uncomfortable, that can tolerate feedback, and that are all engaged in continuous improvement. So we try to get our leaders to think about their job in a school environment is to make people clear about the culture, clear about what's needed, and clear about the support mechanisms that are available. And that's a very different task for most leaders than simply trying to keep people happy. Finally, we use the rubber band test, which is where we describe a rubber band. Liz Wiseman, a US management consultant, I guess needs the credit for this one. And if you can imagine a rubber band, when it's slack between your hands and drooping down, it's not doing anything useful. Its job in life is to contain things. And so for a rubber band to be useful, you ultimately have to stretch it. And Liz would say that's what you have to do as a leader. You have to put some tension into the workplace and stretch it in a particular direction, i.e. the direction of your vision and strategy. And then staff over time, if it's done well, they'll want to relieve that tension a little bit, so the other part of that rubber band will have to contract towards the goal so it becomes slack again. And of course the leader then gently stretches it, and so that cycle of stretching and relaxation occurs whilst we all march towards the one goal. How does this bridge in to where we need to be for the second part of our time together? It bridges in by getting us to engage in whether it's healthy or happy. You know, which way are we driving things? And in doing so, we start to become set up to create a culture where we can start to supportively and persistently create clarity for people in the workforce using those 4 KPIs that create the lens of high-performing teams. What I want to do now is, in this next part of our time, is unpack the high-performing teams framework and show you some examples of how that plays out in schools. So just bear with me one moment. All right, I'm just going to jump through. So we ran through that model earlier about high-performing teams. And just to recap, we know we need to achieve well, but we also need a supportive environment, because we can't have a staff room culture where, you know, everybody's best practice and completely focused on teaching and getting great results to the extent that they're neglecting caring and supporting one another. Nor can we have a culture where they're so busy, I guess, looking after each other that they're starting to neglect some of the indicators that are designed for a high-performance team. So that's very much the lens that we look through. We know that when your team's going well, there are a lot of things that are going to go right for you. You're going to have less claims, you're going to have lower sick leave, lower turnover, etc. We know too, when your team isn't going well, people who aren't even sick take sickies, and so we can see most people have had that experience as leaders where they've seen that in their workforce. We know that when you've got a high-performance team, you've got high-quality production hours, and that means if you think about the cost of having a teacher on board, all of the little things they're doing, we call it discretionary effort in organizational psychology. Discretionary effort, all the little things, the staying back a couple of minutes, the taking the time, the being patient, the sharing of more information. That actually is worth twice the amount you pay them. So it's a fair bit of dollars there if you add that up over time. We also know that a high-performance team is a buffer. It's a life preserver for people who might otherwise be pretty stressed. And we know in Australian workforces, 30% of the people who are at work at any given time actually meet a diagnosis for some form of stress condition, i.e. they shouldn't be there. And so you can imagine then how important and urgent it is to have a high performance team's culture so that your workplace makes people healthy. The next thing we want to do, just in terms of managing our time, is I just want to start to march through those 4 KPIs we talked about and have a look at some practical examples from schools. So, just to recap, we're going to focus firstly on around the achievement side of things and what it all is about when we're getting school leadership teams to embrace this idea of a common vision and clear actions, as well as accountability and performance reporting, because those 2 KPIs allow us as leaders to feel confident that we have a system and a strategy in place that's going to allow our school to achieve. And I was saying to a group yesterday in regional Queensland, there's nothing more anxiety provoking than being given negative feedback about your own leadership or your school's performance when you're not actually clear about why there's a problem. And there's nothing more encouraging than forming your own view based on sound evidence that you're doing really, really well. And so this is why we focus so strongly on these 4 KPIs. And of course, the second set of the 4 KPIs is around engagement and the 2 things we need to do there. So let's get into it and have a first spotlight in on this whole issue of a common vision and clear actions. The question we ask school leaders at this point is, how do you know they know? How do you know that your workforce, that your team are all aligned, are all clear about the school vision and what they do each day to bring that about, to bring that into fruition? You can see some success indicators that we'd audit for, but let's just keep moving at this point. There are 2 core ingredients for an effective vision in education. And most schools have a motto, and that's a fantastic start. But not all schools have effective vision or value statements, also known as school-wide pedagogy. We're lucky in Queensland where we've got a mandated environment for us to have powerful vision and value statements known as SWP or school-wide pedagogy. So the 2 core ingredients we want you to start thinking about with your school vision is that you have that school-wide pedagogy, but inside that clear approach, there is some very clear statements around the healthy workforce culture. So take a moment and think, as Dorothy Andrews, one of those authors, has said to me, if you can't remember right now what your school-wide pedagogy is, it's probably time to have a review of it. School-wide pedagogies should be so clear and so consistent and so simple that we can recall them. Our staff can recall them. Our students understand them. Our P&C committees are all over it and think it's wonderful, and it really becomes a living, breathing part of how our school works together. What do we really mean by that, though? You can see a couple of case examples that we give to people who are kind of trying to understand what this might look like. These are pseudonyms from real schools in New South Wales and Queensland. And you can see the first one, Nagel. Basically, you can see kind of the key points of their school-wide pedagogy. And then looking into the detail of this, you can see clear behavioural ways we're supposed to not only interact with our students, but interact with each other and the community. So this starts to fulfill that recipe. Another classic one I think is fantastic is this one, which is about the hand symbol and about 5 pedagogical principles. This process, I guess, for the school was relatively quick to identify and start, but then a multi-year journey to bring about so it was a living and breathing experience. And what's clever about this one is this is a Catholic school, and these colours that they've chosen match the colours in the Catholic calendar, and so they're entirely meaningful both locally and in the wider community who share that same religious perspective. You know, a really simple thing we could do in public schools in Queensland is house colours. Most schools have different coloured houses that then compete in sporting or other things. There's a real opportunity for a nice simple bridge between the use of colours in houses and, again, our school-wide pedagogy. The last one I love to show is this one about the kites. And again, the work of Dorothy Andrews and Joan Conway, they highlight how important it is to localise and personalise, if you like, into the local community or what our vision is. And this is a windy city, I'll say no more. And so they've chosen the kites. And again, they've used this very simple colour process to create an understanding about what it is we do to bring out the best in our students and care for each other in the business of teaching. And I find these really good artifacts, really good things for people to think about and then take into their own school. So when we're talking about KPI number 1, we're talking about having something that's clear and simple and easy to grasp, But even more important, having a way in which it starts to become part of the meetings that we have. It's on the agenda before we start. In religious terms, we call it the Lord's Prayer. You know, something we recite every day, something that sticks on the bottom of our signature block on our email, something that is somehow reinforced. Colours are a fantastic way to do that through how the students interact and how the P&C committee can embrace it. If we can make that stuff alive, we're off to a very, very powerful start when it comes to being a high-performance team. Looking at KPI number 2, which is our second in the achievement cycle, this is about clear accountability and performance reporting systems, i.e. what gets measured gets managed. And we all know this stuff with Michelle Bridges and a lot of popular TV stuff. The more they get on the scales, the more there's improvements in whatever direction, the more they focus on their eating, the more miraculously it tends to end up in the right spot. We also know this with wealth gurus and prosperity kind of self-helpers. We know that when you go after something and focus on it, you eventually, if you don't get it, you'll certainly come a lot closer to it than you will by not focusing on it at all. Finally, we know this principle in clinical psychology. People who worry a lot and get caught up in a lot of negative expectations about the world or about the motives of others, well, miraculously, unfortunately, it comes true and they end up experiencing a lot more hardship than people who are optimistic. Simple principle. Let's move on. So the question here we ask school leadership teams, do you regularly measure and report back to the right people on the important performance metrics of your team? This is a bit of a curly question often in education because we measure heaps of stuff that perhaps the department and the system says we have to, and they're often about what we call customer outcome measures in other organisations. You know, they're about our NAPLAN data, they're about the school opinion survey, but they don't actually tell us about the stability and well-being of our actual workforce, our staff. Instead, we do that once a year with an opinion survey. Yet, I don't know about you, I fluctuate through the year. You know, the point in time they ask me that may or may not be how I felt a month before, and it may not be how I feel a month after. So we're big fans of investing deeply and heavily in regular updates that the staff are happy to engage in nonetheless, regular updates on how that element is going and getting that type of information cycling back into the people's hands. And that's what you can see on some screens, some examples there. It's not just collecting information about well-being on top of the quite robust and rigorous set of data you've already got. You can also collect information around how you perform in your team meetings, about how you make sure people are accountable to do things. And of course, the wellbeing data itself and how we take responsibility for that collectively and work together to make sure our school is a wonderful place to work in. Some examples of data everyone's got at their fingertips are these types of things. And as we said at the beginning of this webinar, well, the hardest problem facing most schools I see isn't the data. They've already got the data. It's the organizing and marketing or selling of the message, selling the data, shaping it and giving it to people in simple, easy ways that busy people can use it and feel confident that they can make a change to what they're doing based on that. We need to spend probably more of our time in the next decade learning how to organize data, infographics, things we see in social media. Imagine if we had that level of sophistication in our schools. We're much more likely to see students, parents, teachers running with those key messages and being informed by it than, I guess more dry or seemingly disconnected or overly detailed statistical reports. So we like to focus in on that issue when we're working with school leadership teams. The next one, we're getting there, just checking in on our time. We're going well. Number 3 of the 4 KPIs is about leveraging diversity. And remember, and leading by example, remember we said diversity though isn't necessarily gender, race, and all of those bigger ticket items. Diversity also exists in terms of personality clashes and rubbing people up the wrong way. And the question we ask school leaders is, are all those individual differences, that hot pot of different people all working together in your school, does that become an advantage for you, or is it a curse? You can see some success indicators there, practical things that people can do, leaders can do to improve that issue. But the second part of this one is particularly important in education, is this notion of leading by example. Do your staff lead by example or simply mirror behaviour of others? You know, education has one of the highest rates of burnout of all of the professions and some of the highest work cover statistics. And there's a really good reason for that based on an issue called emotional dissonance. And emotional dissonance simply means when we have to fake happy for long periods of time. So teachers get it, police get it, flight attendants get it, customer call center people get it. And leading by example is easy enough in short periods of time when we stay calm if a parent's angry, or we stay calm when dealing with the team. Mind you, we've got our own flight response we've already talked about earlier in the webinar to deal with. But leading by example over a long period of time, during the course of a whole hour or 2 or 3 or a day or a week or a term, when we aren't feeling positive and enthusiastic but have to show it that way, is downright dangerous when it comes to well-being. We know that unless we can regroup, process our emotions, ventilate, you know, all of those normal things to reset, without that ability, we're going to get into trouble. And so, as you can see, the success indicators here are a lot of behavioural skills training, and looking after ourselves. Again, we spend a lot of time in the High Performance Teams program about above the line behaviour. What are the vague, simple, annoying things, the things we're almost ashamed to bring up about other people, the look they give, you know, the way they do certain things? How do we have that conversation? You know, we're adults. We very rarely engage in extreme behaviour. It's the subtle behaviour that triggers that stress response. And so we do that exercise around above and below the line to tap into that. As the next point, we have get staff and get leaders in schools to have very clear protocols for how to tap each other on the shoulder and say, hey, I just need to raise some low-level stuff that's driving me nuts. You know, how do you actually all consistently have a safe way to do that? Or do you just leave it to chance? You know, leaving it to chance is not acceptable. As a leader of a school, you must have a degree of structure around that and a degree of buy-in by your staff that they're all prepared to give and receive feedback as long as it's done in a certain way. And then, of course, you can have lots of fun with team profiling and activities. There's lots of great apps all schools are using around animals and eagles and dolphins and many different personality metrics and measures that can be done in a fun way where we can start to understand each other and work out how to make the most of our individual differences. And finally, buddy systems. And you note there the really important point. The buddy systems aren't just for the new people, and they're not just about how to find where the stationery cupboard is or where things are. The best schools focus their buddy systems on what we call cultural onboarding, as in you get someone else there that shares how the humour works, how the feedback works, how we perhaps run meetings and assert ourselves, how we don't assert ourselves. That kind of stuff is a fast track for success. The last of the 4 KPIs, and thank you for your patience as we've stepped through that, is around this issue of well-being and work-life goals. And as you can see on your screen, there's the classic quote, people who have a why will work can endure anyhow. If we understand the reason people are at school for their jobs, it can often be a very powerful point to allow us to find ways to motivate them and support them. Now, of course, the challenge in all of that is people come to their jobs for different reasons and at different stages and cycles of life. So when we start out as teachers, we might be very passionate from a humanities perspective about really digging deep. And we might then, while still being passionate about it, in the middle of our career, be actually quite consumed by a bunch of juggles between our job and our community and our teenage kids and everything else. And then in our later years, we might, again, still be very focused on being a great teacher, but might be wanting to try other things in the remainder of our career, might want to do the management stuff, might want to do more mentoring. And so not only do we have to find out the why for why people are at work, we have to respect the fact that that why can change and keep it current. And so in that why situation, we need to have clear policies and procedures and support systems that actually create an environment where people disclose information about themselves, as well as the stock standard stuff around employee assistance and flexibility, etc., etc. We need to train leaders in being able to have conversations where people can open up. And most importantly, we spend enormous time helping our leaders role model humility and vulnerability, appropriate levels of vulnerability, share stuff about themselves so that other people will feel okay about sharing too. We trial a bunch of different icebreakers, one-word barometers, check-ins, things we know from high-performance teams in other industries that quickly allow people who may not know each other that well to become very trusting and very engaged and focused and work together. And finally, in the appraisal and development, the more formal structured cycle, we make sure that looking after people's work-life needs or understanding them gets hard-coded into how we plan each year and support staff development. So that really sets us up nicely to have, I guess, had a bit of a look through those 4 KPIs. I'll just break for a second to check if there's any questions, and from there we'll just talk through a bit of an outcome case study, and again have a couple more moments for questions and then conclude the webinar. So I'll just break for a moment.
Thanks, Pete. As you've been moving through the session today, there's certainly been some reflective statements that have been made, and also a lot of the quotes that you've used have resonated with people. When people look at the overarching framework, sometimes it can appear overwhelming. There's a lot to take in. How does the process that you take them through support them in that?
Thanks, Tanya. That's a great question. And indeed, when we I guess tend to, I've jumped that slide back up for everyone. There's a lot to unpack inside this, as we've just seen. It's quite a a metaphor, I suppose, of the trolley in the supermarket. Suddenly, it's gone from empty to overflowing, and certainly it's an apology from me, in as much as that's not what we're trying to do. But I think Tanya's tapped into something that we can all relate to, and that is the need to be able to take the complex and return it into something that's simple and manageable. And so, yeah, I've jumped that slide back up to say, so even though I guess we've taken what will take a whole year and we'll give people anywhere up to half a master's degree, so we're talking about a lot of knowledge and a lot of sophisticated knowledge, and we've just compressed that into a 30-minute kind of discussion from me. We learn in increments, and I like to remind the people I work with in this program to get in deep, to deep dive into all that content, albeit in a paced way over 4 days, over 12 months with a book and all sorts of other support. But then to settle back, look at that triangle again and just filter, almost allow things to settle into their boxes. Because the reality is, as we said, this is just a lens, a way of looking at the world. And when we can look at the world through those 4 KPIs, firstly, all school leaders are already doing a lot of fantastic things in these 4 areas. So this isn't about suggesting people aren't already on top of it. What it is about, though, is saying if we can all look at it the same way, then we can start to share things and use the same words and have a simpler reference point. And by pooling all that information in a way we can all understand it, we can speed up the innovation, the fun, and the student outcomes in a way that we've probably never been able to do that before, simply because we're all speaking the same language and sharing ideas through the same lens.
So is it a bit about making the way of working in our school transparent and clear, so it's not hidden or assumed? Is that part of the process?
Yeah, absolutely. Our job is to make sure, as we said in the Why Teams Fail part, our job is to make people clear more than it is to make people happy. And that's on that. The confidence we have that when we make things really clear for people, again, professionally and supportively, it becomes really obvious for them to find their place in the school, to find the armchair in the staff room where they feel they can belong, because they understand and choose to be there. Anytime we compromise clarity by some of those toxic leadership behaviors, by withholding information, by only telling a certain few, or even accidental stuff by only emailing a certain number of people and accidentally missing other people out, by not pinning it up on the notice board, by not repeating it 3 or 4 times so everyone gets it. Any of those accidental sins as well are ultimately going to put a strain on and ultimately drop performance. Yeah. They're great questions, Tanya. Thank you for that. I'm conscious in our time now to let's have a look at where the rubber hits the road with some data. Because there's one thing as I guess someone who trains leaders, it's all very well to have your theory and claim to know what you're doing and maybe have a lot of letters after your name. It's a completely different thing to put the rubber on the road. So I've just spent a couple of minutes now showing you some data, chance for some more questions, and then we'll conclude our webinar. These are the slides we're about to see are some outcome data, and what I wanted to do here is to show you some outcome data from education mainly, but before that I wanted to show you how high performance teams work across industries, because that's one of the hard parts, I think. You know, do we end up doing something that's meaningful for all human beings at work, or do we only do something that really just fits one sort of spot? So let's have a look at the outcome data. All right, we want to look at wellbeing data, productivity, and costs. Let's get into it. So this is the Southern Vale cluster. This is straight into workforce wellbeing, and this is 2015 data from 6 schools that were involved in this project. What we had here was all Queensland schools, about 160 of them that we collect wellbeing data on, and the Southern Vale High Performance Teams schools, who were actively working on the stuff we've been talking about today. What's particularly interesting about this data set, firstly, thank goodness it worked, but also look at job demands and pressure, the central one. One of the things teachers and school leaders talk about is this sense of pressure and burnout. And it's obviously real, let's be clear about that, but what we measure here is how they feel about it, i.e. perception. And you can see that there's a significant positive result, i.e. where all of those 4 KPIs, where that school's humming along, working hard on all the things we've just talked about, even though the school might be a high needs, high demand school, as some of the Southern Vale schools are, even with that team support actually makes people feel that it's not as hard. And we know that when they can change the way they feel about it, they can tolerate all of the actual objective demands that they actually have to do. Let's have a look at some more data quickly. The next one is a hospital environment. And so this is a corporate services, a business administration type team. And you can see over time, again, this interesting pattern where the black line tells the averages story. Bit by bit, things go in the right direction in terms of improving. What's particularly interesting here very quickly is what you see at the end of the graph, which is job demands has favorably risen. That means similar to that other one, they actually feel like their job's really under control, even though this particular team, I ran this project in September, has some of its most critical crunches and deadlines in the cycle of hospitals. So it's the worst time of the year for them, but it's the peak time where they felt like it was under control. But correspondingly, notice the grey line, the co-worker support line. See how that's gone down? And that's really important too, because in a high-performing team, people tolerate high workload, but they actually have high trust as well. And so there will be some healthy conflict in a high-performance team. And we really saw this line represents, I guess, an evolution of trust and the ability to have fierce conversations in the team. So you got a lot of improved work performance there. Alrighty, let's start to wrap. Then, yeah, this slide simply goes through the ROI benefits. So, they spent, $40,000 on their intervention over 12 months, and then, they got about $500,000 in ROI, and then a one-off thing they fixed, which saved $30 million. So all we're trying to say there is there's some pretty big savings. In the last minute or two, I'll jump now to a school-based one. And again, we've had to do the pseudonym of West key state school, but it's a regional Queensland school. And we just want to have a quick, I'll be pretty quick in here, apologies if I'm going fast, but I want to show you their data and what really happened. So what we can see right up front is their action plan, and you'll remember that that's what all schools need to do as part of the program. After those first 2 days together, they have an action plan. Here's their stuff around KPI 2 about accountability and performance reporting. They need to reset the roles of senior leaders. It wasn't clear, it had gone a bit stale, who did what, and that was causing some tension at a leadership level, but confusion among the staff. Okay, they also needed to tighten up around making people responsible to do certain things in the school. That fed into their strategic plan. Here you've got leverage diversity, lead by example, and again some examples there about communication protocols, buddies, structuring team meetings to have time for icebreakers, codifying things, etc. So again, I'll jump through because time is upon us, but you can see the idea around action plans, and unfortunately I apologise, some of the other action plan items aren't in the slide pack, but the slide pack we'll have available for you. We'll have all of that in it. Alrighty, so what they did, let's wrap it up. What they did, they really got into that KPI 3 and 4 around well-being, and they used a lot of social warm-ups. They got everybody into the habit of speaking freely about themselves in a safe way. And then this was a classic, they actually took it to extremes and got these Hawaiian leis, those flowery kind of necklaces, and they kind of, excuse my language, took the piss out of themselves, so to speak. They encouraged a couple of events where the students, albeit with rules, but nonetheless the rules allowed everyone just to lighten up a bit and have a laugh. And out of all the things they did, they kept saying that was the tipping point when they could finally do that as a whole workforce and break through. And as you can see, they did all sorts of other things there as well. But you can see a lot of this was on the engagement side of that triangle, as distinct from the achievement side. But that isn't to suggest they didn't achieve, because sorry, just bear with me with the slides. Let's have a look at their achievement data. That's where I want to go now. So there they go in their strategy. They're warming up the culture. They're spending lots of on-purpose time, doing things that on the outside may seem foolish. But let's check it out. Look at their well-being data over 6 months. Okay, look at the trending. This is a school that was coming off a low base, and this shows the fluctuations. And of course, you all know that term by term things fluctuate quite heavily with peak times of work. Again, what's your linear? What's your average line? You're going in the right direction. Let's just have a quick scan of this stuff. Here's some NAPLAN data. Again, it tells a story about things going in the right direction. Your effect sizes. Again, you guys are more expert at this than me, but what you can see there is the school's gain, the effect size, compared to the average. Again, that tells a really important story. And then, as I said, some of the other really critical trending data, where you can see the green lights and the traffic lights, that haven't quite worked on our slide, so we'll make sure they're updated. Finally, school opinion survey. So this is the staff view. And as you can see, quite statistically significant improvements in terms of how the staff are feeling about things. And yes, this slide's here too. This one is particularly important to me because this is a regional school in a small community. And so if you don't have the parents and the local community on board, as we all know, you're on a hiding to nothing. Look at the massive improvement that this school was able to make through its innovations in high performance teams. So that kind of gives us, in a nutshell, what it is we wanted to cover in this webinar around high performance teams in education. We wanted to share, and apologies for the theory, but the natural bias about why feedback just doesn't happen no matter how skilled we are, and why it needs to be a priority for leaders to create the right culture of safety and clarity so that people can grow. We've deep dived into each of the 4 KPIs around vision and action, performance reporting, data, leveraging diversity, and well-being and work-life balance, and showing you very clear, explicit strategies schools are using that you can start today to use in your school to see an uplift in each of those 4 areas. And by doing that, albeit tiny tweaks perhaps as a starting point, simply starting with icebreakers in meetings all the way through to robust action plans, accountability, self-governance, and other things, by taking one step forward in each of those 4 success KPIs in this next term and building it further from there, you're absolutely going to be able to, with confidence, say as a leader of a school, I'm on the journey up. So thank you so much for your time with me. We're going to have some time for questions, and from there we'll then bring this to a conclusion.
I'm sure all of you agree in thanking Dr. Pete today for taking us through the high-performing team pathways using the 4 KPIs. And as we were talking in that session just after the questions before, we were talking about conflict and healthy conflict. And there was a question there that said, oh, you know, healthy conflict, what does that sound like? You know, what does it look like? And because it can be quite challenging, it's probably an area that we don't really talk about much in there. So I'll just let you respond to that.
Thanks, Tanya, and thank you too for that question from people attending. That's a really good point about healthy conflict. What feels healthy for one person may absolutely feel quite terrifying or frightening for somebody else. And I guess there's 2 ways to answer that. One is healthy conflict at a systems level or a leadership strategy level. You know, looking at the chessboard, that's about having ground rules in place around our meetings, around how we talk with one another, the above and below the line type stuff, and having those ground rules clear and regularly reminding staff of those ground rules. I know that's not necessarily answering the question, but that's part of the environment you first have to set up. By setting up that environment, you will resolve or improve everybody's tolerance of difficult conversations, which is to allow us all for it all to get a bit more argy-bargy before all that stress response triggers going on. So yeah, very quickly, you've got to set up the structure properly. You've got to have bumble the line, you've got to have your moderator, your red, yellow cards, all these kinds of things that we go through in the program. The second part, though, is about the 2 of us in that conflict, and that's about skills drills. Healthy conflict is easier to understand if people have had some training, and there's a lot of different providers doing really high quality stuff around fierce conversations. We call it difficult conversations, courageous, you know, any of that stuff. It's all really good stuff, but it's all about a shared understanding, because unhealthy conflict is easier to answer, and that's simply when there are no ways to stop it, to shape it, to defer it, to give people feedback saying I'm not feeling safe. So as long as you have those ground rules in place, you can classify what happens next as healthy conflict.
Excellent, thanks Pete. I'm sure this has provoked many questions for many of you listening today, and we can continue the conversation on our VCR blog, where you received the link for that yesterday, I believe. So as the time has gone over time, because we had so many questions to respond to, we'll wrap up the session, and I'd like to thank you all for your participation in the second of this 12-month series. The next webinars are occurring in Term 2, and they're focusing on the work of Dr. Peter Sullivan and the use of open-ended questions in classroom, and how that they can be used, in fact, to promote positive dispositions and develop the conditions for positive learning communities within the classroom. So I'm just going to hand over to Maria now to close today's session.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you, Tanya. Everyone, if you'd like to provide some feedback on this web conference, there's a short survey there to fill out. It shouldn't take very long to fill out. While you're doing that, I will send out the certificate. So you should be receiving a prompt now and it will say Tanya Leach has sent you a file, which is the certificate, and ask you if you want to save it. Just click yes and save it somewhere on your computer where you can remember to retrieve it from. If you haven't received that certificate, if you give me a cross, and I will send it again.